The gnome was the final straw. Not the overgrown grass, not the slightly tilted mailbox, not even the fact that my flower bed had one too many daisies. No, it was the gnome, painted in patriotic red, white, and blue, that sent the HOA president into an absolute frenzy. You have exactly 72 hours to remove this abomination from your yard, or you'll be facing serious consequences, the letter taped to my front door read. There was no greeting, no pleasantries, just a cold, bureaucratic threat printed in block letters. I turned the paper over, expecting some kind of elaboration. Instead, there was just one more line, written in what I could only assume was furious cursive. This is not a democracy. This is the HOA. I stared at the letter, then at the gnome, then back at the letter. The gnome, as usual, said nothing. If it had feelings, I imagined it would be deeply offended. I, on the other hand, was trying to decide whether to laugh, cry, or prepare for war. Given my history, war seemed like the most appropriate choice. Patricia Hargrove, Patty to those unfortunate enough to know her well, ran the HOA like a third-world dictator with an unlimited supply of clipboard paper and a personal vendetta against Joy. She had already fined my neighbor for having an excessively cheerful wind chime, berated an elderly woman for planting unapproved marigolds, and issued a written warning to a man whose car was too red. She was relentless, but until now I had stayed under her radar. Apparently, my peaceful days were over. I walked into my house and tossed the letter onto the kitchen counter. My cat, a judgmental Siamese named Atticus, glanced at it, then at me, as if silently questioning my ability to coexist with suburban life. He wasn't wrong. I had spent decades navigating the highest courts in the country, battling complex constitutional cases, and dismantling legal loopholes designed to manipulate the system. And now? Now I was being fined for a lawn ornament. I considered ignoring it. Maybe I could just pay the fine and let it go. But then I thought about Patty's smug face, about her power trips, about the way she ruled over this neighborhood like some self-appointed queen. No, this wasn't about the gnome anymore. This was about principle. And if there was one thing I didn't do, it was back down from a fight, especially when the rules were this ridiculous. The next morning, I stepped outside to assess the so-called violations. The grass was maybe half an inch too long, certainly not the crime of the century. The mailbox leaned slightly to the left, but it was fully functional. And the gnome? The gnome was staying. I folded my arms, surveying my yard like a general preparing for battle. If Patty wanted a fight, I'd give her one. The first strike came swiftly. By noon, another letter had arrived, this one more aggressive than the last. Failure to comply will result in additional fines and possible HOA legal action, it warned. Respect the integrity of the community. I couldn't help but laugh. Integrity? Patty had once tried to evict someone for having an inflatable Santa Claus on their lawn in December. This wasn't about integrity. This was about control. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting. If Patty wanted to play lawyer, I'd let her. Unfortunately for her, she had no idea who she was dealing with. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room with beige walls and folding chairs that screamed low-budget jury duty. Residents sat in neat rows, some looking bored, others terrified. At the front of the room, Patty stood like a monarch surveying her kingdom, a stack of violation notices in her hands. When she saw me enter, her lips curled into a knowing smirk. I took a seat in the back, watching as she went through her usual routine, fining one person for a door wreath that was too festive, scolding another for a garage door that was a slightly different shade of white than regulation allowed. Finally, she got to me. "Evelyn Carter," she called, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You have received multiple warnings regarding your property's failure to meet HOA standard. Would you like to explain why you have refused to comply?" I stood up, adjusting my blazer. "Of course. But first, I'd like to clarify something. On what legal grounds are you enforcing these regulations?" A murmur ran through the crowd. Patty blinked, clearly not expecting resistance. The HOA guidelines are very clear, she said. Every homeowner agrees to them upon moving in. I nodded. Right, but I did a little reading, and it turns out some of your rules contradict state property laws. For example, the statute regarding lawn height is arbitrary and inconsistently enforced. There's also no legal precedent supporting your authority to fine someone over a garden gnome. Patty's face twitched. The HOA has full authority to maintain the aesthetics of the neighborhood. I smiled. Do you have a legal citation for that? Because according to the actual legal code, the HOA can only regulate property elements that directly impact community safety or property value. A gnome does neither. The room went silent. Even the guy with the aggressively cheerful wind chime looked impressed. Patty's mouth opened and closed like a malfunctioning ventriloquist dummy. We have rules, she sputtered. And I have rights, I countered. Now, unless you'd like to explain why you're selectively enforcing these so-called rules, I'd suggest reconsidering that fine. Someone in the audience snorted. Another person clapped. Patty's face turned red, then a shade of purple I hadn't seen before. She wasn't used to being challenged, and she definitely wasn't used to losing. Finally, she snapped. If you don't comply, I will take legal action. I tilted my head, pretending to consider it. That's an interesting approach. You know, I've spent my career ruling on cases just like this. Maybe I'll take this to court myself. It would be fascinating to see how a judge interprets these regulations. Patty frowned. What do you mean? Ruling on cases? I smiled. Oh, didn't I mention? I'm a Supreme Court justice. A collective gasp filled the room. Patty looked like she might pass out. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh my God." I patted the fine notice in my hand. So tell me, Patty, are you sure you want to take this to court? Patty didn't respond right away. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The color drained from her face, then returned in an angry flush. She looked around the room as if hoping someone would jump to her defense, but no one spoke. Even Greg, the so-called legal expert she had dragged along to the meeting, suddenly found his clipboard very interesting. I smiled at her, waiting. I knew this game well. Silence made people panic. Patty was used to steamrolling over her victims with rulebooks and passive-aggressive threat. She wasn't used to someone like me, someone who not only knew the law but had spent decades enforcing it at the highest level. She had stepped onto a battlefield she didn't even know existed, and I could see the moment she realized it. Finally, she straightened her spine and cleared her throat. Regardless of your occupation, you are still required to follow the HOA rules, she said, her voice a little less confident than before. This is not about personal power. It is about maintaining the harmony of our community. I raised an eyebrow. Harmony? You mean like how you fined Mrs. Kowalski for having a rose bush 2 inches outside the approved garden perimeter? Or how you threatened legal action against Mr. Barker because his garage door wasn't the exact shade of vanilla white you approved? That kind of harmony? A few chuckles rippled through the room. Patty's eye twitched. This meeting is adjourned, she snapped, slamming her gavel down like she was presiding over the fate of the universe. Further discussion will take place in private correspondence. I watched her gather her papers in a huff, knocking over a cup of coffee in the process. Greg hurried after her, still avoiding eye contact with me. The crowd started to disperse, but several neighbors approached me with quiet enthusiasm. That was the best thing I've seen in years, said a man in a Hawaiian shirt. You've got guts, whispered a woman in oversized glasses. Patty's been terrorizing this neighborhood for years. A few people asked if I was actually a Supreme Court justice, and I saw the moment of realization dawn on them when I confirmed it. They walked away shaking their heads, muttering about how this was going to get interesting. And they were right. It was about to get very interesting. The next morning, a new letter appeared in my mailbox. Unlike the previous ones, this one had a legal tone, though not a particularly sophisticated one. It was from Greg, acting as Patty's legal representative. I read it over coffee, amused at the formal yet clumsy attempt at intimidation. Dear Ms. Carter, it has come to our attention that you are in violation of multiple HOA regulations. Due to your continued resistance, we are left with no choice but to pursue legal action. Failure to comply may result in fines, property liens, or further consequences as determined by the HOA legal team. Respectfully, Gregory T. Hargrove, ESQ. I chuckled. ESQ? That was rich. Greg's legal credentials were about as convincing as a diploma from a cereal box. Still, this meant Patty wasn't backing down. She was actually trying to take me to court. I placed the letter down and glanced at Atticus, who was lazily cleaning his paw on the kitchen counter. She's really doing it, I said. She's really trying to sue me over a gnome. Atticus yawned, unimpressed. If Patty wanted a legal battle, I was happy to oblige. I spent the next few hours drafting my response, carefully wording it in a way that would both dismantle her claims and subtly remind her who she was up against. I cited state property laws, pointed out the unenforceability of several HOA regulations, and attached a copy of a recent appellate court decision that invalidated similar HOA overreach. I kept it professional, but the underlying message was clear. This was not a fight she could win. I sent the letter via certified mail, just to make sure she couldn't pretend she hadn't received it. Then I waited. 3 days later, another meeting was called. This time, the turnout was even larger. Word had spread fast, and it seemed the entire neighborhood was eager to witness the showdown. When I arrived, Patty was already there, sitting stiffly at the front of the room, her expression locked somewhere between fury and desperation. Greg was next to her, flipping through a folder with the nervous energy of a man who knew he was woefully unprepared. The meeting started with the usual formalities, but it was clear everyone was just waiting for the main event. Now, regarding the matter of Ms. Carter's ongoing HOA violations, Patty announced, gripping her gavel like a lifeline, "We have decided to escalate the issue to legal arbitration." I leaned back in my chair. Arbitration? That's interesting. Are you aware that HOA disputes in this state must first be handled through a mandatory mediation process before arbitration can even be considered? Or did Greg fail to mention that part? All heads turned toward Greg, whose face turned an impressive shade of pink. He stammered, flipping through his papers. Well, we believe this case qualifies for immediate arbitration due to the severity of the infractions. I tilted my head. Severity? You mean my grass being slightly too long and my gnome being too patriotic? A few people chuckled. Patty clenched her teeth. The rules are the rules. I nodded. And yet, they must be enforced fairly and within the limits of the law. Which, by the way, you are not. Patty's jaw tightened. We will be seeking legal remedies. I smiled. Great. I look forward to it. The room fell into a stunned silence. Nobody expected me to call her bluff so easily. Patty clearly expected me to back down or grovel for forgiveness. She wasn't prepared for someone who actually understood the legal system. Greg leaned toward her, whispering something. She stiffened, then turned back to me with a forced smile. Perhaps we can come to a mutual resolution, she said through gritted teeth. I pretended to consider it. Perhaps. But only if we address some inconsistencies in your rule enforcement. For instance, why is Mr. Thompson allowed to have a decorative fountain in his front yard, but Mrs. Kowalski's rose bush was considered a violation? And why was Mrs. Garcia fined for a door wreath, while your own holiday decorations remained untouched? The room buzzed with murmurs. A few heads turned toward Patty, eyes narrowing in suspicion. The air shifted. This was no longer just my fight. This was about everyone. Patty's hand clenched around the gavel. This meeting is over. But the damage was done. I stood, gathering my things, and turned to leave. As I passed Greg, I leaned in slightly. A word of advice, I said, keeping my voice low. If you're going to play lawyer, you might want to actually study the law. He swallowed hard and nodded. As I stepped outside, I felt the weight of several eyes on me. The neighborhood wasn't just watching, they were waiting. And I had a feeling this wasn't over. Not yet. Patty was losing control, and she knew it. The cracks in her carefully crafted kingdom had been exposed, and the neighborhood was starting to see what I had seen from the very beginning. This wasn't about community standards or property values. It was about power. For years, she had wielded the HOA rulebook like a medieval weapon, using fines and regulations to bully homeowners into submission. But now, for the first time, someone was fighting back. And worse, that someone was a Supreme Court justice. It didn't take long for her next move. 2 days after the disastrous HOA meeting, I received a thick packet in the mail. The envelope was labeled with official HOA letterhead, though I highly doubted it carried any actual legal weight. Inside was a formal notice stating that I was now being sued by the HOA for repeated and willful violations of community regulations, including but not limited to improper lawn maintenance, unauthorized decorations, and disruptive conduct during HOA proceedings. The document was riddled with legal jargon, but I could see right through it. It was nothing more than an intimidation tactic, one last desperate attempt to make me fold. I set the letter down, sipping my coffee as I watched the morning sunlight stream through my kitchen window. Atticus, as usual, sat perched on the counter, lazily flicking his tail. He didn't seem impressed by the legal battle unfolding before us. I sighed, rubbing my temple. If Patty wanted to take this all the way, I was more than happy to oblige. But I had a feeling she wouldn't like how it ended. A few hours later, I made a call to an old friend. Judge Ronald Hayes had been a colleague of mine for years, and while he usually presided over state-level civil cases, he owed me a favor. I explained the situation, making sure to highlight the absurdity of it all. By the time I finished, he was laughing so hard I thought he might drop his phone. "You mean to tell me," he wheezed between chuckles, "that some overzealous HOA president is trying to sue a Supreme Court justice over a garden gnome?" "That about sums it up," I said dryly. "Well, this I have to see. File your response, and I'll make sure it lands on my desk." I hung up, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. Patty had no idea what she had just stepped into. The court date was set for the following Friday. By then, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with excitement. People whispered about the upcoming trial in hushed tones, speculating about whether Patty would actually go through with it or back down at the last minute. I could see the anxiety in her eyes whenever we crossed paths, but she was too stubborn to admit defeat. She had spent too many years being the unchallenged ruler of this neighborhood to simply step aside now. When the day finally arrived, I dressed in my usual professional attire, feeling a familiar sense of purpose settle over me. It had been a while since I'd stepped into a courtroom in this capacity, but some things never changed. The law was the law, and I knew it better than anyone. The small courthouse was packed. Word had spread beyond our neighborhood, and it seemed half the town had shown up to witness the showdown. Patty sat at the plaintiff's table, her face pinched with determination. Greg was beside her, flipping nervously through his notes. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. Judge Hayes entered, adjusting his glasses as he took his seat behind the bench. He glanced at me, amusement twinkling in his eyes, then turned to Patty and Greg. "Plaintiff may present their case," he said, barely suppressing a smirk. Patty shot to her feet, launching into a long-winded speech about the importance of maintaining community standards. She spoke of order, of rules, of the necessity of obedience for the greater good. It was all very dramatic, but legally it was meaningless. She had no case. When it was my turn to speak, I remained seated, casually folding my hands in front of me. "Your Honor," I said calmly, "this entire case rests on the idea that the HOA has the authority to enforce these regulations without oversight. However, as I will demonstrate, their enforcement has been inconsistent, arbitrary, and, in some cases, legally invalid." I proceeded to dismantle every single one of Patty's arguments with surgical precision. I cited property laws, HOA governance statutes, and case precedent. I provided evidence of selective enforcement, showing how Patty had used her position to target certain residents while allowing others to violate the same rules without consequence. I even presented financial records that hinted at HOA funds being used for personal expenses, something I had stumbled upon during my research. By the time I finished, Patty looked like she was about to explode. Greg had given up entirely and was now staring at the table, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Judge Hayes sighed, shaking his head. Well, this is certainly one of the more unique cases I've presided over. He turned to Patty. Mrs. Hargrove, the court finds that your enforcement of these regulations has been inconsistent and, in many cases, unlawful. Therefore, this lawsuit is dismissed, and the HOA is hereby ordered to reimburse Miss Carter for any fines or legal fees incurred during this dispute. A gasp rippled through the room. Patty made a strangled noise, her hands gripping the edge of the table. But she... The decision is final, Judge Hayes interrupted, banging his gavel. And I strongly suggest the HOA reviews its policies to ensure they are in compliance with state law moving forward. With that, it was over. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as people turned to stare at Patty, who sat frozen in place, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly. I stood, gathering my things with a satisfied smile. As I walked past her, I paused just long enough to whisper, "Told you this wasn't a fight you could win." That evening, the neighborhood celebrated. Someone set up a barbecue in their driveway, and people gathered with drinks and laughter, exchanging stories about all the ridiculous fines they had endured over the years. Patty was nowhere to be seen. The next morning, a new notice appeared on the HOA bulletin board. Effective immediately, Patty had resigned as HOA president. I sipped my coffee, watching as people stopped to read the notice, their expressions shifting from shock to delight. Atticus, perched on the windowsill, flicked his tail as if giving his approval. A week later, I received one final letter from Patty. It was short and to the point. "I hope you're happy. You've ruined everything." I read it twice, then placed it in the recycling bin. I hadn't ruined everything. I had just reminded everyone, including Patty, that power only exists when people allow it. And in this case, the HOA's reign of terror was officially over. I stepped outside, breathing in the crisp morning air. My gnome still stood proudly in my yard, its red, white, and blue paint shining in the sunlight. It wasn't about the gnome. It never was. It was about standing up to people who thought they could bend the rules to their will. And if this neighborhood had learned anything from this experience, it was that some battles were worth fighting. As I turned back toward the house, I smiled. Retirement was supposed to be quiet, but if this was any indication, I had a feeling I was going to enjoy every second of it.